Hi, so we're going to be talking about the gender economics within South Korea, and this presentation is being made by Anuva, Bennett, Wilson, Grace, and myself.
Sorry.
Next slide.
Sorry, my computer's okay, cool. We're good. Okay, first I'm gonna start by summarizing gender equality in South Korea. So on a global gender gap index, they were ranked 108th out of 153 nations. And they were ranked on 4 different categories, being economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. So they had various results in all of these, with their best category being health and survival, with when they got 1 out of 53. So they were tied with 39 other nations. And their worst aspect, they were 127 out of 153. And they only had a score of 0.555 out of 1. So that was their weakest area. So this graph just kind of summarizes all of those results. And the gray areas show all the points along the graph where South Korea fell. So as you can see, they did really well in educational attainment and health and survival. And their weaker areas were economic opportunity and political empowerment. So one of their first barriers to gender equality would be fertility. So there's a lot of discrimination towards women who have babies. So one study looked at working women, and they ranked how much discrimination they experienced in the work field, and the ones that experienced the high levels of discrimination were significantly less likely to have children or even plan to have children. So only 59% or only 57% of women who experienced high discrimination even planned on having a child, versus 80% of women who had low discrimination in their workplace had a child. So these parental leave programs are not flexible enough for working mothers, and this could be a possible explanation for why only 52% of the labor force, or only 52.9% of women are in the labor force. And they have an average fertility rate of 1 birth per woman, which is extremely low.
So another barrier to gender equality is marriage, and we based our discussion about this on the marriage market model, which states that the women's utility of marriage and the men's utility of marriage comprises the total utility of marriage. And one little caveat to that is that the woman's utility gained through marriage is also the men's utility given up by marriage. So it's kind of a little trade-off. And the main decision to marry is going to be based on if the utility of being married for both parties is greater than the utility of staying single for both parties. And throughout time, both the marriage rate and the age at first marriage, throughout time, the marriage rates have decreased, but the age at first marriage has increased. So the marriage rate decreasing has been a combination of both the population in Korea increasing and the number of marriages in South Korea decreasing. And the age of first marriage, as you see in the graph below, has just skyrocketed within the last 30 or so years. The women's age to marry has gone up by over 6 years, and that is the same for men. But the factors behind these marriage trends, they don't exactly correlate with the total utility of marriage. In the Bessie study that I've cited here, the more traditional marriages where the male was the main breadwinner and the woman was the main housekeeper, they actually had the highest levels of happiness, whereas the non-traditional marriages where the women shared equal income levels or they were more educated, they had lower happiness levels. Next slide. But there has been progress being made towards gender equality, and one example is the labor market, and this is driven by the labor supply model, which states that the value of market time, which is wages, must be greater than the value of non-market time, which is the reservation wage, in order to enter into the labor market. And usually, historically, South Korea took a more traditional stance on labor force participation, which was the aforementioned male breadwinner, female housekeeper. But this is starting to change as of recently. And the labor force participation graph on the bottom right kind of demonstrates that how men's labor force participation kind of stayed the same, but women's increased from a little bit below 50%, about 48%, up to 52% ish in 2015. And this has been accompanied by increases in wages. The women to men earnings ratio in South Korea has increased by over 10% from 1990 to 2010. And the education levels have also increased. The percentage of South Korean women who have a post-secondary degree over the age of 25 went from 8% in 1990 to over 30% in 2010, and this is just continuing to increase. And just education in general, whether it's post-secondary or not, as we see on the graph, as we see in the graph on the bottom left, the percentage of South Koreans by gender for secondary education is, the gap is closing, even though there is still a gap there, but women's education went from below 40% to basically 70%. And these two changes, wages and women's education levels, have led to changes in the labor supply graphs, where the budget constraint has, the slope of the budget constraint has increased, which this led to um, what's it called? Narrower indifference curves, where it's where the shoot, where the indifference curves are flatter, sorry, there's an increased incentive to trade the non-market time for market time, which leaves women to spend less time at home. Next slide.
So going a little bit further in depth into women's increasing educational attainment in South Korea. So throughout the second half of the 20th century, changing cultural and economic conditions in the country led to the empowerment of women through increased educational opportunities. Throughout South Korea, people's values have typically laid in the teachings of Confucius, which stressed that education is the best way for achieving high social status and economic prosperity. That being said, South Koreans also generally accepted traditional gender roles in which the mother would stay at home and care for the children while the father was the breadwinner. But high fertility and low labor force productivity started to take a toll on the country's well-being. And to combat this, the government implemented a family planning project in the 70s that stressed quality over quantity in terms of childbearing, but this simply wasn't enough. And in 1997, the country suffered from an immense recession, making the opportunity cost of having children increase greatly, and thus decreasing parents' preference for having a male child rather than a female. Going back to the point about Confucianism and empowerment through education, after the recession, the country adapted a new cultural climate deemed the education favor, in which the parental drive to raise successful and competitive children increased. In this sense, the cost of childbearing increased greatly in order for people to send their children to top schools. In turn, this caused fertility to decrease and the preference for male children over female children to decrease further. And as a result, the education gap between male and females in South Korea declined greatly, opening the door for women to earn higher paying jobs and to participate in the labor force in increasing numbers. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay. As for a policy to help eliminate discrimination against women with children, we propose that the government should refund and reform paid family leave. So right now in South Korea, they currently have a paid family leave, which is a 1-year policy, and it's 40% of the woman's original salary, which is really low. As women receive $400 to $1,000 per month as well, but just paid by employment insurance until their child is 6 years old. So depending on how much the family makes, they get that amount of money. Instead, we propose that South Korea could have employers make separate accounts for paid family leave, So this would be similar to a 401k plan where the company matches the amount of money that an individual puts in for the future, like a pre-tax, for when they eventually go on family leave. So this account would be specifically for the mother, knowing that eventually they will have a baby, and then they can use that money when the time comes. This will allow mothers to be on paid family leave for as long as they choose, but also, you know, if they have another child, they can use that money for the other child as well when they go on family leave again. This policy keeps the employer from discriminating against women because the employer does not have to take money out of their own revenue to pay for family leave. This would also increase the likelihood of women to have more than one child.
And so an example of this, an example that South Korea should model their reformed family leave plan off of is Canada. So Canada has a pretty advanced system of parental leave. So briefly getting into it, there's two kinds. There's standard parental leave, and in that one, it can occur for up to 40 weeks in total and 35 weeks maximum for each person. So that's 5 weeks minimum per parent. So each parent that's on standard leave can receive up to 55% of their earnings, up to $562 per week, within 42 weeks of having the child or placing adoption. And then the other type of parental leave is extended parental leave, which grants someone 69 weeks in total, where someone will get 33% of their earnings, up to $337 per week. And that's within 78 weeks of having a child or adopting. So as you can see, this is an improvement over South Korea's current policy and offers more benefits that can both empower women with children, but can also help float families with socioeconomic statuses that they're struggling with as well. And so this graphic over here basically is just showing you basically where paid maternal leave is implemented across the world. The dark blue shows where there are countries that have 26 weeks or more, and South Korea is one of those countries, which is pretty great. Unfortunately, the US is not. And so that being said, again, in comparison to the rest of the world, South Korea does have a lot of reforms that it can continue to make. So the economic model that we're using to explain this is going into the neoclassical economic theory of child quantity and kind of how it relates to fertility. And so we get into kind of the model here and how a child, how having a child is subject to a utility maximization process. And that's a function of economic costs and benefits of children subject to an income constraint and to individuals' preferences for children. So again, kind of revisiting what our policy proposal is, we want to propose paid maternity or paid family leave policies to act as subsidies for child services. And so this is kind of a continuation of what specifically that model would entail. So basically in this model, what happens is when you give paid family leave or paid maternity leave, and we're looking at it specifically the effect on the mother's wage, when a mother is out of the labor force and she's going through pregnancy and she has her child, she's obviously out of the labor force. So that means that her wage would with no paid leave would be zero. And that's her individual utility, not including her husband's. But if you give women paid maternity leave or paid family leave, it brings that to a stable amount. So that's in this model is the equivalent of a women's or wife's wage change in that economic utility function. And so the variable wife's wage impacts both income, full income, and it impacts price for child services. And so this is describing what happens in that graph. So basically, when wife's wage increases as a result of our family leave, it leads to two effects. The first is the substitution effect, and the second is the income effect. So what happens when the substitution effect happens is that this decreases the price of child services, and then as a result, it increases the quantity demanded for child services, while on the other hand, the income effect decreases demand for child services. But overall, the income effect is smaller than the substitution effect, so price overall decreases and quantity overall increases. And that's it.